Over the course of the 7th century, the world was divided. Vast empires clashed as new kingdoms rose in their wake. But through it all, people still wanted stuff from each other. And thanks to some big changes in technology, they had more ways than ever to get it. So empires rose and fell, but trade kept growing. Let's see how. I'm here, and this is Crash Course Geography, a study of humanity's interaction with its environment. And our story begins in Jerusalem. In 614 AD, the Muslim Sasanian Empire captured the city, which was home to Christianity's holiest sites. By the end of the century, most of the Middle East and North Africa were Muslim. But there was still one place that wasn't. It was the Byzantine Empire centered in modern-day Istanbul, the capital of the Eastern Orthodox Christian world. And the Byzantines didn't like being surrounded by Muslims. In 629, Emperor Heraclius led a counterattack to take back Jerusalem, kicking the Sasanians out of the city. When he died 5 years later, his son Constantine took the throne. But while Heraclius was away fighting, the Western Roman Empire had fallen, and the Lombards had taken over much of Italy. So now Constantine had a problem. He needed to defend his empire from invaders along the Rhine River in the north, and from the Sasanians in the east, who were attempting a comeback in the Levant. To help him, Pope Gregory I asked European Christians to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Pilgrimage is a journey to a holy site. But these early Christians faced dangerous conditions on their way to Jerusalem. Along with having to traverse rugged mountains and deserts, they had to pass through lands controlled by hostile powers, and they often got attacked. So not a lot of people went on pilgrimage, at least not at first. Meanwhile, the Sasanian Empire was also asking Christians traveling through their territory to convert to Islam or pay a special tax called jizya. If they refused, they got taxed at a higher rate and weren't allowed to enter Jerusalem. Over time, both the pilgrimages and the taxes became more and more difficult, and European Christians grew increasingly frustrated. And then in 1054, the Great Schism split Christianity into two branches, making matters even worse. That's when the Bishop of Rome, who would become known as the Pope, excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, the leader of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Not only did this make it harder for European Christians to go to the Holy Land, but it also inspired them to take it by force. And in 1068, Pope Gregory VII called for an official church-backed military expedition to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom. 4 years later, thousands of European nobles and knights answered the call and set out to capture it. We call this the First Crusade. For 10 months, they fought their way east, burning villages and killing anyone who resisted them. But they never came across any organized military forces, because by this point the Muslim world had grown tired of their shenanigans and stayed out of the Crusaders' way. Eventually, in 1099, they reached Jerusalem and laid siege to the city. It lasted only 2 months. The Crusaders slaughtered almost everyone inside, including many fellow Christians. They established 4 Crusader states in the region, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And ever since Europeans could travel safely to the Holy Land on pilgrimage, between 1095 and 1187, over 10 million Europeans visited Jerusalem.
Wow.
But it was a costly endeavor. The kingdom's constant wars made ruling extremely expensive and taxes were high. So most of the time, European rulers had to hire mercenaries to do their fighting for them. But those 4 Crusader states were always under threat from the Muslims in the area who did and appreciate the violence of the Crusaders. And so to defend pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem, in 1118, Pope Paschal II created the Knights Templar, a holy order of warriors committed to defending the Holy Land. 2 years later, Gerard of Balbez commissioned another holy order called the Hospitallers, originally a charitable organization providing food and lodging to pilgrims. But the Muslims continued to fight back against the Crusader states. And in 1187, Saladin, the leader of the Ayyubid dynasty, recaptured Jerusalem. Only 200 European Christians were allowed to stay in the city as hostages. Now, despite the loss of Jerusalem, the Crusades continued. Between 1189 and 1192, 3 more European kings tried to win it back during what we call the Third Crusade. But though the Crusaders nearly succeeded, they were unable to recapture Jerusalem, and they made a treaty with Saladin to allow Christian pilgrims access to the city. Still, the Christian kingdoms held on to other territories around the Mediterranean. And for the next 200 years, Europeans traded along the coast in ships powered by lateen sails. Triangular sails that allowed ships to sail more efficiently into the wind. This was part of a wider shift toward maritime trade rather than overland caravans. And trade along the Mediterranean increased dramatically. Because seafaring was easier, though mountainous terrain and deserts were still major barriers to trade, rivers also remained important. For example, in 1173, King Louis VII of France commissioned the construction of a road between Paris and the English Channel. And in 1180, he opened a fair, a gathering where merchants could buy and sell goods near Paris. This was the beginning of what would eventually become known as the Paris Bourse, one of the largest financial exchanges in the world. But it wasn't just in France. Italian city-states like Venice boomed due to their geographic location on the Mediterranean. They grew wealthy by collecting taxes on merchant ships passing through their waterways. And Venice became so powerful that in 1297, they passed a law that prohibited merchants from trading in their ports unless they were Venetian. This was an early example of a nation-state, a state that had a large degree of autonomy or self-governance within a larger political unit. But there was also a lot of trade going on beyond Europe and the Mediterranean. In India, cities like Delhi and Bengal grew wealthy trading textiles, spices, ivory, and diamonds with China, Central Asia, and the Middle East, and in China. The Song dynasty saw dramatic economic growth thanks to advances in agriculture and technology. These included a compass for navigation, gunpowder, paper money, and printing. In fact, the Song dynasty was one of the first to use credit, allowing farmers to borrow money to grow cash crops like cotton. But this growth didn't come without problems. As cities grew, so did inequality and crime. So to address this, governments developed new legal codes. For example, in 1215, English nobles forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, which limited his power and protected their rights. And in 1258, the Song dynasty collapsed when the Mongol Empire conquered much of China. But before that, through war and diplomacy, the Mongols had already integrated themselves into many Chinese cities. And unlike other empires, the Mongols didn't destroy existing cities. Instead, they built new ones. For example, in 1220, Genghis Khan founded the city of Karakoram, which became the capital of the Mongol Empire. Even after Genghis Khan's grandson Guyuk made the empire into a tributary state of China, Karakoram continued to grow as the center of trade between Europe, China, and the Middle East. In fact, because the Mongols controlled such a vast amount of land, merchants could now travel faster between Europe and Asia than ever before. This meant there were more opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. Like when Italian merchant Marco Polo traveled to Karakoram in 1245 to work for Guyuk. After 4 years, Polo traveled south to China and spent 17 years in the court of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and founder of the Yuan dynasty. When he returned to Italy in 1269, Polo wrote about everything he'd seen on his travels and inspired many Europeans to go to Asia. But while Polo experienced the benefits of Mongol rule firsthand, others did not. Like when Guyuk took over Hungary in 1241, he burned villages, destroyed farmlands, and killed many people. So people in Central and Eastern Europe fled west, increasing population pressure in western cities like Paris, which grew from 100,000 to 200,000 people in just a few decades. And this migration helped spread ideas about the wealth of the East. The Crusades are among the most notorious episodes in history. But what really happened? Hello, and welcome to this channel. Today we'll look at Episode 5, Part 2 of how trade shaped power and civilization. Between 1095 and 1291, European Christians went on a series of religious expeditions called the Crusades. Let's start with how they did. The Second Crusade failed because it lacked planning. In 1147, German and French leaders launched the Second Crusade. They hoped to capture Jerusalem, but their armies were poorly coordinated. And after heavy losses, the crusade ended in failure. Meanwhile, Muslim leader Saladin rose to prominence and took back Jerusalem in 1187. He became a hero in the eyes of Muslims, Christians, and Jews for his courage, piety, and fairness. Then came Richard the Lionheart, the protagonist of many medieval tales. Richard led the Third Crusade in 1189, aiming to recapture Jerusalem. He fought bravely, but ultimately Saladin outmaneuvered him. In 1192, Richard agreed to a 3-year truce that allowed Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City. This was a significant moment. Despite military setbacks, Christians could now visit Jerusalem to worship at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus was crucified and buried. However, tensions remained high, and the truce didn't stop further conflicts. Soon, the Fourth Crusade shocked the world by attacking Constantinople. In 1202, Venetian merchants got involved. They convinced the crusading leaders to attack the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire instead of the Holy Land. What went wrong? The Crusaders sacked Constantinople, one of the greatest cities of the Eastern Roman Empire, and looted it for 3 days. They seized control of the city and established a Latin Patriarchate of Constantinople, marking a dramatic shift in the Crusades' objective. The sack of Constantinople had profound consequences for medieval Europe. It diverted attention and resources away from the Holy Land and toward the Mediterranean. Additionally, the sack contributed to the decline of trade along the eastern Mediterranean coast. By disrupting established trade routes and alliances, the Crusaders hindered economic activity that had connected Europe and Asia for centuries. This diversion of trade routes had ripple effects on both regions, limiting the flow of goods and ideas between them. Instead, trade shifted westward, contributing to the growth of Italian maritime republics like Venice, Genoa, Sfarin. These seafaring cities thrived by controlling lucrative trade routes in the western Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. Venice, in particular, benefited immensely. Its strategic location and growing wealth turned it into a major player in European politics, even challenging the supremacy of the Eastern Roman Empire. Moreover, the sack of Constantinople led to cultural exchanges between Western Europe and the Middle East. European scholars gained access to Greek and Roman texts preserved in Constantinople, which fueled the Renaissance in the 14th century. This intellectual exchange also sparked theological debates as Christian scholars in Western Europe engaged with Muslim and Jewish thinkers, discussing topics such as biblical interpretation and the nature of religious authority. As the Crusaders interacted with diverse cultures, they brought back stories about the riches and wonders of the East. This exposure sparked interest among European elites who started acquiring luxury goods like spices, silk, and precious stones. The demand for these exotic commodities played a role in shaping European tastes and preferences, laying the groundwork for future exploration and trade expeditions. However, the seizure of Constantinople was a turning point. The focus of the Crusades shifted from the Holy Land to the Mediterranean and beyond. While there were subsequent campaigns to the Holy Land, the momentum and fervor of the earlier Crusades waned. Despite the sack of Constantinople, the Third Crusade managed to reach the Holy Land, but without success, failed to take Jerusalem. Its pilgrimages continued under the supervision of a holy order known as the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, also called the Knights Hospital. They protected pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem until they lost control of the city in 1291. That brings us to Sin. The last Crusader city fell in 1291, ending an era. After the fall of Acre, the last Crusader stronghold in 1291, the era of the Crusades effectively came to an end. This marked a significant turning point in history, bringing to a close the centuries-long Christian military campaign to regain control of the Holy Land. Consequently, trade along the eastern Mediterranean coast saw a decline as the protective presence of the Crusaders disappeared. Without the military support of the Crusader states, trade in the region suffered due to increased risks and disruptions. Furthermore, the loss of Acre deprived European merchants of an essential hub for their activities in the eastern Mediterranean. This setback limited access to lucrative markets and disrupted established trade networks that connected Europe to Asia. The Crusades were a complex phenomenon with far-reaching consequences. Here are some ways they changed the world. The Crusades left behind war, wisdom, and change. Firstly, the Crusades resulted in widespread warfare and violence, causing immense suffering and loss of life. Battles like the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the Siege of Acre in 1291, which witnessed brutal tactics and massacres, exemplified the devastating impact of these campaigns. The constant state of conflict disrupted trade, destabilized regions, and left lasting scars on the communities involved. Secondly, despite the violence, The Crusades fostered cultural exchanges and the spread of knowledge. European scholars gained access to classical texts in Constantinople, contributing to the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance. The interaction with Muslim and Jewish scholars stimulated discussions on theology and religious authority. Moreover, the Crusades sparked an interest in travel literature, as European chroniclers documented their experiences in the Holy Land and beyond. These accounts provided first-hand insights into different cultures, customs, and landscapes, enriching European perspectives. Finally, the Crusades had a profound impact on trade patterns and economic development. The establishment of trading posts and commercial interests in the Levant initially fostered economic activity. However, the sack of Constantinople in 1204 diverted trade routes westward, contributing to the growth of Italian maritime republics like Venice. The Crusades also influenced the emergence of new industries such as shipbuilding and navigation, as European powers sought to protect their interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. In summary, the Crusades represent a pivotal period in history marked by conflict, cultural exchange, and economic transformation. While the centuries-long endeavor to capture Jerusalem and other holy sites ultimately fell short of its military objectives, it left an enduring legacy on medieval Europe and the Middle East. The Crusades forever changed the course of history. They connected Europe and the Middle East in unexpected ways. They triggered shifts in trade routes and the rise of powerful Italian maritime republics, and they helped to shape the cultural landscape of medieval Europe, influencing everything from art to literature to science. The Crusades' legacy continues to resonate today. Their impact can be seen in the architecture of European cathedrals, the writings of medieval chroniclers, and in the very fabric of medieval society. Understanding the Crusades allows us to explore this complex tapestry of history, revealing the interconnectedness of civilizations across time. Thank you for watching. What do you find most surprising about the Crusades? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more engaging historical tales. And if you'd like to dive deeper into this topic, we've included a curated selection of resources for further exploration. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.